January 2026, a single bottle of Kentucky bourbon sells at Sotheby's for $162,500. Not a rare wine, not a painting, corn whiskey. Americans didn't fall in love with bourbon by accident. Somebody built that obsession on purpose. Not once, but twice. And right now, in warehouses across Kentucky, the second version of it is already coming apart. Here's the story I believed for years, and you've probably heard some version of it too. Bourbon is America's native spirit. Kentucky corn, limestone water, charred oak, a tradition running back to the frontier. Some of that's just fact. Bourbon has to be made in America, from mostly corn, aged in a brand new charred oak barrel used exactly once. 95% of it comes out of Kentucky. But America's native spirit? That phrase is doing a lot more work than it lets on.
In 1964, Congress did pass a resolution about bourbon. Some lawmakers weren't thrilled. Distilling was still tangled up in organized crime investigations, and a handful of companies controlled nearly 3/4 of the liquor trade. Handing a blue-collar corn whiskey a formal seal of approval felt to some of them like rewarding the wrong industry. It passed anyway, but read the actual text, and it says nothing about heritage, patriotism, or Kentucky pride. It just declares bourbon a distinctive product of the United States. Dry, legal language, built for one purpose: blocking foreign companies from slapping bourbon onto a bottle made anywhere else. Think trademark, not tribute. The man who pushed hardest for it wasn't a patriot. He was a liquor executive named Louis Rosenstiel, who ran Schenley, one of the biggest distilling companies in the world.
A decade earlier, expecting the Korean War to trigger a shortage the way World War II had, Rosenstiel ran his distilleries flat out, 637 million gallons by one estimate, enough to cover the country's demand for nearly 8 years. The shortage never came. By his competitors' own estimates, he was suddenly sitting on 2/3 of all the aged whiskey in America, with nowhere to sell it. So he got clever. Instead of dumping the surplus at a loss, he rebranded it. Old inventory became aged whiskey. Aged whiskey became a luxury good. He poured $35 million into advertising and shipped promotional cases to U.S. embassies worldwide. When his competitors, sitting on their own surpluses, saw it working, they climbed aboard too. And together, they pushed the 1964 resolution through Congress. Here's the part almost nobody knows. The phrase America's native spirit isn't even from 1964. It wasn't coined until 2007 by a different Kentucky senator, 43 years later, then quietly folded into the original resolution as if it had been there all along. Repeat a phrase like that enough times, attach it to the right law, and it stops sounding like marketing. It starts sounding like history.
So, bourbon had its myth by 1964. What it didn't have, for the next several decades, was actual popularity. Starting in 1978, bourbon sales fell every single year. Americans reached for vodka, for anything that wasn't their grandfather's drink. By the early 2000s, one whiskey historian was seriously asking, in print, whether bourbon was headed the way of mead, a novelty kept alive out of nostalgia, one generation from disappearing. The native spirit Congress had declared in 1964 spent the next 30-odd years being mostly ignored. Then, almost out of nowhere, it wasn't. The comeback started in New York cocktail bars in the early 2000s, reviving pre-prohibition recipes. Then, a certain ad executive on a certain prestige drama made day-drinking bourbon look like sophistication itself. By the mid-2010s, premium bourbon sales had grown 135% in 5 years. And that's when the second engine started running. Not patriotism this time, but scarcity, engineered on purpose. Take Pappy Van Winkle. The distillery that makes it could produce more. It chooses not to. A bottle with a suggested retail price around $300 is deliberately kept scarce, because a bourbon everyone can buy stops feeling special, while a bourbon nobody can find becomes exactly the kind of prize people will pay thousands for on the secondary market. That's not an accident of supply. That's a strategy. It's the same logic behind that $162,000 bottle from the start of this video. Scarcity, built and maintained on purpose, quietly converted into value.
And the scarcity fed on itself. Bourbon production in Kentucky grew by 475% between 1999 and 2022. Sales grew too, just nowhere near as fast, which meant something was quietly piling up behind the scenes, barrel by barrel.
At the start of 2026, Kentucky distilleries were sitting on more than 16 million barrels of aging bourbon, the largest stockpile in the state's history. An oversupply some analysts put at 3 times what the market can actually absorb. Jim Beam, the best-selling bourbon on the planet, paused production at its main distillery for the entire year. Brown-Forman, the company behind Jack Daniel's, cut more than 1/10 of its global workforce and sold off its own barrel-making operation. Bourbon exports to Europe dropped by more than 1/4, part of a trade war nobody in Kentucky started. Sound familiar? It should. It's Louis Rosensteel's mistake again, decades later and several times larger. In 2021 and 2022 alone, distillers barreled some of the highest volumes in the industry's history, betting the boom would keep climbing forever. It didn't. Nobody gets to unpour the whiskey already resting in those barrels. All they can do is wait, some of it for years, for demand to catch back up to a bet that's already been made. There's a twist buried in that wait, too. Jim Beam's bourbon needs at least 4 years in the barrel before it's ready, which means a full year of paused production is a full year of supply quietly missing from shelves around 2030. The industry may be manufacturing its next shortage right now, without even meaning to. Proof that this cycle doesn't really end. It just changes which decade you're standing in when it turns. So, why are Americans so obsessed with bourbon? We're not, really. Not on our own. Twice now, in 70 years, a small number of people making long-term bets on barrels decided the answer for the rest of us. Once by turning a surplus into a patriotic legend, once by turning real popularity into artificial scarcity. Both times, it worked so well, it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like it had simply always been true.
I still love the stuff for what it's worth.
That was never really the question. That bottle that sold for $162,000 isn't worth that because of what's inside it. It's worth that because twice in 70 years, somebody convinced an entire country it should be. We didn't fall for bourbon. We were sold it. Twice. And said yes so completely, both times, that we forgot anyone had asked.